Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 6 for PPA 500. We'll go ahead and get started for the evening and let your colleagues join along the way. I think we have a majority of folks here already. So this is week 6, and it's out of 8 weeks. And so we are progressing very quickly to the end of our time together as a class. I warned you in the very first class session that these hybrid courses go by very quickly. And I guess this is proof of it, that we're already in week 6. It's kind of hard to believe we're there already. I reviewed your Canvas essay number 3, and those have all been read and feedback provided on each one of those. Again, I think everyone, just like with Canvas essay number 1 and number 2, I think everyone did a really nice job with number 3. Your responses were insightful. They addressed the prompt very well. They identified some salient differences and similarities between the public and private organization of your choosing. Some of the commonalities that we saw were commonalities such as in the differences. Just the hiring process is so very different between the public and the private sector, and sometimes it's a much more protracted process for hiring employees in the public sector, and that can certainly have some serious ramifications for hiring the best and the brightest, and sometimes people get tired of waiting, and so they then move on to private sector organizations if it takes too long for them to get their jobs. A lot of people talk about the scrutiny and what we call the fishbowl effect as a major difference between public and private sector organizations. Several folks talked about the generic management functions as being similarities between the two sectors. And so, again, I thought everyone did a really nice job of identifying those similarities and those differences. So just keep doing what you're doing on the Canvas essays and we will be fine. Canvas essay number 4, which is due next week, looks at the same type of thing you did on your midterm assessment in talking about public administration as a discipline. And there is a method to that madness. I know you've already talked in the midterm about public administration as a discipline and arrived at a position as to whether or not it's a discipline. The reason why I'm asking you to replicate that in this Canvas essay number 4 is it affords you the opportunity to share it with your colleagues. And so it's really, we can have that type of dialogue in the discussion board about public administration as a discipline. So completing this Canvas essay should be very quick and easy for you. You can just take your answer from the midterm assessment and you can just distill that down into 2 or 3 paragraphs, and that can then be used as your Canvas essay number 4. So you're certainly welcome to use your answer from the midterm for Canvas essay 4, and then we'll, again, get a dialogue going between everyone in terms of whether public administration is or is not a discipline. And really for a class like this, that's really the central concern of this class, is really introducing you to the study of public administration, how we study public administration, and this whole question of whether or not public administration is an academic discipline is really central to what we are doing here in this class. So that's your Canvas essay number 4 that is due next week. Your midterm assessments, I have reviewed, graded all of those, and people did a very nice job. I was really impressed with how well everyone did on the midterm assessment, very pleasantly surprised. The grades were much higher than they typically are on a midterm assessment, so you should all be commended for that. All the grades congregated in the A and the B range. I don't think we had any grades out of the B range, and so again, that's a very good thing. I thought, again, your answers were insightful. I was really impressed with your ability overall to be able to convey a good deal of information in your answers, but to do it in a very cogent and a very concise type of manner. And so I think people really did adhere to this idea of parsimony in crafting your answers for the midterm, and I really do appreciate that. The feedback I gave on the midterm assessment, there's general feedback in the feedback box. But then I use the annotation feature to provide specific feedback on the different scenarios. And so you'll see those little blue dots in your midterm. If you click on those blue dots or hover over them, you'll then see my comments. And every blue dot is a different comment, a different annotation. I certainly did not grade the midterms for grammar or anything like that. I was just looking at content for the midterm assessment. And again, I think everyone did a really nice job. All the grades were in the A and the B range. So you should be commended for your performance on that midterm. Now, I hate to do this to you because you just finished the midterm, but now we have to start talking about the final assessment, because the final assessment is due in 2 weeks. And so I always make it available 2 weeks before it's due. And so it is now available on our Canvas site. So you can go and you can review the final assessment if you have not done so already. And like I did with the midterm, I would like to start off class tonight going through the final assessment, walking through the different scenarios and questions on the final assessment, just so we all know what we are doing and what I'm looking for in terms of your answers on the final assessment. Now, the final assessment, the format is exactly the same as the midterm assessment. So just do the final the way you did the midterm, and you'll be in very good shape grade-wise. So 5 scenarios, 2 questions relate to each scenario worth 20 points. Each question obviously then is worth 10 points for a grand total of 100 points on the final assessment. And the final assessment is then due no later than 11:59 p.m. on March 14th, so 2 weeks away. So let's go through the scenarios, and we can probably do this relatively quickly. Now, you don't have all the information currently in order to be able to answer all the scenarios on the final assessment. We will, by the end of class next week, you will have all the information you need in order to complete the final assessment. So information that you'll need in terms of policy and program evaluation, you'll get that tonight. Information on measuring effectiveness, you'll get that tonight as well. Then that's probably all we'll have time to cover tonight. The next week, you'll get the information on the development of public employment, the areas of public employment, and how we manage human resources and fiscal resources. And so you'll get all that information at the class next week. So at the end of next week, you'll have everything you need to then complete the final assessment. So let's take a look at what some of these scenarios ask you to do. So in scenario number 1, your friend applied for a job with the FBI 8 months ago. And that's not very far-fetched, because we actually have several students who have graduated from the program who either joined the program as members of the FBI or went on to get jobs with the FBI. So it's one of those agencies, at least at the federal level, where we've seen a lot of our students end up going over the years. So your friend applied for this job with the FBI 8 months ago. She is obviously frustrated with the delay in the hiring process. Bills need to be paid, so she finally decided to accept a job with a private sector company. She laments to you how she wishes she could have waited for the FBI job, but doesn't understand how the federal government hires new employees. As a good student of public administration, you decide to provide her with some background information on the eras of public employment in the United States. Describe the 3 main eras of public federal employment and how these eras have changed over the years. Next week, we will talk about the eras of era of gentlemen, the era of spoils, and the era of merit. And we'll talk about how we transition between those different eras and then how hiring is currently done today. In 1B, after regaling your friend with the history of federal employment, you begin to reflect on current hiring practices. Which era or eras best represented by today's federal employment and why? And we'll talk next week about what public employment looks like today and which of those eras is represented by the way in which we hire public employees today. So that's kind of your development of public employment question for the information that you'll get next week. Scenario number 2, the Department of Aging, which is our old friend for the midterm. We had the Department of Aging as one of our scenarios on the midterm, now has a new leader. Mr. Lemon is gone. Remember, Mr. Lemon was this incompetent leader of the Department of Aging on the midterm. And the new governor has selected you as the head of the department. You walk into an organization that has neglected human resource management functions for years. One of your first meetings is with the human resources director to discuss how to modernize HR functions. Positions have not been reviewed for several years, and most employees are working outside of their position descriptions. So you're basically going in this organization and you're cleaning up a big HR mess. A lot of functions of the HR process have been left unattended. They have not been done for many years. You're going in there and you got to clean up this mess that Mr. Lemon left. So question 2A, what would you instruct your human resources director to do? In other words, what functions of human resource management need to be completed? And we'll talk about those functions in class next week. 2B, another major issue faced by the organization is its relationships with its bargaining units. The current contract has expired and the union and department are now at an impasse. Discuss the strategies that could be used to resolve this impasse. And we'll talk about collective bargaining, we'll talk about negotiations, and we'll talk about impasse resolution. and I'll present to you 3 different categories of impasse resolution: fact-finding, mediation, and arbitration. You'll be discussing those strategies then here on question 2B. So again, information from next week. Number 3, this is your managing fiscal resources scenario. So the city of Preble Heights, another throwback to our midterm, is struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in the GDP, the gross domestic product. So they index their increases in expenditures, the money they're spending, to increases in the gross domestic product. Over the past 5 years, the city failed to complete its budget on time and struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and objectives. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and these are 2 of the main credit rating agencies that rate the credit worthiness of cities based upon their finance. Both Standard & Poor's and Moody's have reduced the city's credit rating due to its budget issues. As a city council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns that have been mentioned here in this scenario. In question 3A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in this scenario. So you're going to recommend a new budget format. We'll talk about 4 distinct budget formats next week when we talk about managing fiscal resources. You'll be selecting one of those 4 and then recommending why it's most appropriate in this situation. And then 3B, the city's aquatic center needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it is clear that the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. The aquatic center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a $3 fee to use the facility, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. The city also charges a $20,000 per year fee to the school district and club teams to use the facility for practices. A total of 6 teams pay this fee. So you got 6 teams paying $20,000 a year in order to use the facility. And then you have citizens who are paying $3 to use the facility, and you have 100 of those residents using the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. So just simple multiplication there to determine how much money they are raising. The operating expenses for the aquatic center amount to $180,000 per year. Since the city does not have the money to pay for renovations, it proposes a bond to cover the cost. Next week, when we talk about managing fiscal resources, we will talk about these things called bonds. And bonds are long-term debt issues that whenever you need to borrow money as a city, and it's going to be a long-term borrowing of money that you're going to pay back over maybe 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, you issue what is called a bond. We will talk about different types of bonds in class next week, and I'll identify for you 4 different types of bonds. Which type of bond would you recommend, and then provide a justification for why you are recommending that type of bond. So again, this is your managing fiscal resources scenario information that you'll get at the very end of class next week. So it'll be kind of the last topic, the last real substantive topic that we cover here in PPA 500. Then scenario 4, the city of Preble Heights also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, or the ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate their facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. So it's an inducement to keep these facilities in their jurisdiction. The primary beneficiaries of these grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city. And the urban areas of the city are primarily the downtown area for the city. To be successful, the policy would need to provide enough grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe that it's not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow-walking grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. 4A, from a policy implementation perspective, utilize Pressman and Wildowski's implementation research, and we will talk about Pressman and Wildowski in just a few minutes here tonight, Utilize their implementation research to illustrate some of the barriers to successfully implementing this policy. And then in 4B, drawing upon the 4 models of organizational effectiveness, and that's one of the last things we will talk about in tonight's class, examine this scenario from the perspective of each one of these models. How would each model of effectiveness define the agency's effectiveness in implementing this policy? And I'll identify for you 4 different models of effectiveness, 4 different ways of measuring effectiveness in the public sector. We'll talk about how those models work tonight, and you'll then be using this information in order to answer question 4B. And then last but not least is scenario number 5. It has now been 2 years since Preble Heights renovated its recreation center. The Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Julia Lopez, approached the council last year with a proposal to address juvenile delinquency in the city. The city has seen a rise in the incidents of graffiti and vandalism over the past several years. Ms. Lopez proposed creating a program of after-school sports offered free of charge at the Recreation Center. The after-school sports program is offered from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturdays. The goal of the program is to give youth something to do after school and deter them from engaging in acts of graffiti and vandalism. The program has been up and running for a year. You are a program specialist, and the city manager has approached you to create a program evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of the after-school sports program. In question 5A, identify and discuss the primary independent, dependent, and control variables that you would use in your program evaluation. And then in question 5B, identify and discuss the research design that you would recommend using to evaluate the effectiveness of this program. We will cover program evaluation tonight. We will talk about how we use classic social science research methods in order to evaluate the effectiveness of programs. I'll introduce you to some broad categories of research designs. We'll talk about how we measure variables and do all those types of things we need to do in order to properly evaluate the success or failure of our public programs. So the information for scenario 5, you will have that information by the time we leave class this evening. So those are your 5 scenarios. Again, after tonight, you'll have enough information to answer at least 2 of those scenarios. At the end of class next week, you'll have enough information to answer all 5 of those scenarios. Same ground rules apply. And so in terms of being parsimonious with your answers, you were parsimonious with your answers in the midterm, do the exact same thing on the final assessment, and everyone, I'm sure, will do as well on the final as everyone did on the midterm assessment. So that final assessment is available to you, so you can go and review it and start working on these 2 scenarios that you have the information for as soon as we're done with class tonight, and then finish up the other 3 after we complete class next week. Any general questions about the midterm assessment? I think, having the final assessment, I think having the midterm under our belt, we kind of know how the whole process works. And so this final should be a little bit more intuitive in terms of completing it. So any questions on the final assessment at this point? Okay.
Jay has a question real quick.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Jay.
So did I understand correctly that tonight we'll learn about 4 and 5, and then next week is 1, 2, and 3 questions on the final?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. You got it. Yeah, and Regina, thanks. Thanks for the kind words. Yeah, trying to get these things turned around as quickly as possible and try and get your feedback as soon as I can. One of my pet peeves when I was in graduate school, I had 2 main pet peeves. One was not getting papers back and not getting a feedback returned to me. And then when I would get feedback, it would not be very descriptive feedback. And I would just, my very, not to digress too much, my very first graduate level class, I really thought I was going to do this amazing job on this paper. And I actually put together, it was like a 70 or 80 page paper. I actually took it and had it bound at Kinko's or whatever the production shop was uptown. I had it bound, turned out I was really proud of it. And then when I got it back, I got an A- on it, which, not bad, but I want to know why I didn't get an A. And I leaf through it, I go through every page. There is not one stray mark from the instructor on any of those 70 or 80 pages. At the end, all the instructor wrote is, it kind of peters out at the end, A-. That was the feedback I got on my first graduate level paper. And I don't think that's fair. So yeah, I'd like to try and give you feedback quickly. And so if there are points that have been taken off, you kind of know which scenario the points came from. And so I think that's important to do, especially in a graduate program. So thanks, everybody. Okay, let me stop the share of the final assessment. So we'll get rid of that. And let me go ahead and share out our slides for tonight. So again, where we are at now in the class, gosh, let me go ahead and get the show going. There we go. Where we are currently in the class is now we're at the point where we are talking about what we do as public leaders and public managers within the environment of public administration, within our public organizations. So last week we talked about the theoretical development of the literature in public administration, focusing primarily on the study of public organizations, because we identify public administration as a study of public bureaucracies, identify public bureaucracy as a public organization. So obviously one of the major things a public administrator, a public leader, and manager will do is to manage their organizations for the purpose of trying to make their organizations as effective as possible. But within managing their organizations, we also know that public leaders and managers also engage in the policy-making process. We also know they engage in evaluating public programs. We know that they manage their human resources within their organizations. And we know that they are also entrusted with managing fiscal resources and managing public taxpayer money. So throughout the rest of the class this week and next week, that's what we're going to be focusing on, some of these discrete functions and duties of public leaders and public managers. So to start out tonight, we're going to talk about the role of public managers and leaders in the policy-making process. And this is kind of a foreshadowing for your PPA 670 policy analysis course. And in your policy analysis course, you will cover different phases of the policy-making process. And the way in which I like to cover the policy-making process is to deconstruct it into three main phases: formulation, implementation, and evaluation. And public administrators have a role to play in all three of those phases: formulation, implementation, and evaluation. Obviously, formulation is creating the policy. Implementation is actually implementing and actually putting the policy into effect. And then evaluation is evaluating the outcomes of the policy to see if the policy is achieving its goals and its objectives. Is the policy being effective? And again, public administrators have a role to play in all three of those phases of the policy-making process. So let's start with formulation. Now, when we talked about the differences between public and private sectors, we said one of the big distinctions is that the public sector is involved in both policy formulation as well as implementation execution, whereas the private sector is typically not as involved in policy formulation. Policy formulation is a process of putting that policy together. And tonight we're going to talk about policy and we're going to talk about programs. And let me kind of distinguish between those two and a way in which you can distinguish between public policies and public programs. Public policies are those overarching goals. So we may have a public policy goal of housing unhoused residents. And so to address the homelessness issue, we want to house all unhoused residents within our jurisdiction. That's the goal of our housing policy. That's the overarching overall goal. How we then house these unhoused individuals, we will do it through the implementation of specific public programs. So perhaps we'll have a public program of converting hotel space into livable areas, affordable livable areas for people who are unhoused. That's a public program that will support this overall policy goal of housing unhoused individuals. Maybe we'll have a voucher program. I'm just throwing some things out. A voucher public program, whereby we will provide vouchers that these individuals can then use to go and purchase housing. That is a public program that supports the housing of unhoused individuals, supports that overarching policy goal. And so the public programs can kind of be seen as the supports, the things that hold up the public policy. So if you want to think about it, it's kind of like a bridge. You know, I used to live in Southwest Florida, and we had bridges that went over all the bays and over all the lakes and across the Gulf. And if you drive from Southwest Florida, where I live, to Key West, you literally get there going across this big bridge. You think about the policy as kind of the road that you're driving on. It's the bridge, and then those big concrete stanchions that go into the Gulf that hold up the bridge, those are the public programs. So the public programs support the overarching public policies. So to start out tonight, we're going to talk about those overarching public policies, how we formulate those policies, how we implement them, and how we evaluate them. And then after we take a break, we'll come back and talk about public programs. And we'll talk about how we then evaluate those specific public programs that are implemented in order to support this overarching public policy and those policy goals. So we have to put together the policies to begin with. We have to formulate the policies. And as we talked about when we talked about power in a previous class, we talked about John Gaventa and his 3 different faces of power. If you remember, we identified the second face of power as being this mobilization of bias, which we called agenda setting. And we said that the coal mine owners were able to keep the issue of mine safety off of the agenda of the state legislature. And in doing so, they made sure that no law would ever be passed, no policy would ever be formulated to require those coal mine owners to engage in all these different safety measures, such as dusting mines and limiting number of hours worked per week. But we said that the coal miners didn't know why those policies were not being formulated. They just knew that they weren't being formulated. That was this type of power known as mobilization of bias or agenda setting. Before a policy can be made, an issue must make it onto the formal decision-making agenda of a formal decision-making body. There's a very famous public administrator by the name of John Kingdon, and one of his articles appears in the classics textbook. And John Kingdon talks about how issues make it from the societal general agenda onto the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making organization. And he basically makes the argument that essentially something needs to happen. There needs to be the development of what he calls a policy window. And whenever that policy window opens up, it's the combination of a problem being identified, solutions or proposals that have been identified to solve that problem, and then something happens politically that makes it politically advantageous for elected officials to actually make a change and put this issue on the agenda and actually then formulate a policy to address this issue or this problem. So it's very important before any policy can be made is that it must make it onto the formal agenda of a formal decision-making body like a legislative body. But as we are going through this policy-making process and as we are formulating and creating our public policies, at its very heart, policy formulation is all about decision-making. We are making decisions about which problems are important enough that we need to spend money on addressing. We're making decisions about how we're going to address those problems, what our goals and objectives are in addressing those problems. We're making decisions about who will be the beneficiaries of this policy, who will derive the benefits of this change in policy. We're making decisions about who will pay for this policy, how are we going to pay for it, and who is going to pay for it. Are we going to pay for it through a general tax increase? Are we going to pay for it by redistributing money from one policy to another policy area, borrowing money? How are we going to actually pay for it? Who's going to be paying for this policy? So those are all the decisions that we are making in the formulation of a public policy. And in making those decisions, in order to help us understand how these decisions get made by elected officials as well as by public administrators, we need to have some models that can help us explain how decisions get made. And so the 4 decision-making models that we cover in this class are rational comprehensive decision-making, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model decision-making. I think those 4 different decision-making models give us a pretty good universe of different ways in which we tend to make decisions on public policies and during the public policy process. So let's talk about each one of those types of decision-making models, what they are and how they work. So the first one is the rational comprehensive decision-making model. And this is one that you are probably familiar with. Whenever we make decisions on a rational basis, we are saying that we are going to collect all the information we can, and we're going to base our decisions on rationality. It's kind of like what Max Weber talked to us about last week with our classic ideal bureaucratic organizations. Classic ideal bureaucratic organizations base their decisions on empirical evidence. We collect information, we analyze that information, and then we use that information in order to make our decisions. So Max Weber is really big on this idea of rational decision-making. So in rational comprehensive decision-making, sometimes it's referred to as the root approach to decision-making. Our first step is to clearly identify our goals. So we will sit down and we'll clearly identify what are we trying to achieve with this new policy. What are our goals and our objectives? And our goals are kind of our long-term things we're trying to achieve. Our objectives are our more intermediate, shorter term things we're trying to achieve that will then help us eventually achieve those longer term goals. So we clearly identify our goals, and everyone agrees on what our goals are for this policy. We then collect all the information that is out there, all the information that is available. We then analyze all that information, and we use all that information to identify means or ways in which we can achieve the goals. So we take all the information and we use it to then essentially identify solutions. And these solutions are the solutions to our policy problem. They will help us achieve our policy goals. And since we are collecting all the information that is out there, we will generate a full range of these alternative solutions. So every alternative solution that can possibly happen, we put those all together into this full range of alternatives. We then analyze each of those alternatives. We might do something like a cost-benefit analysis, and we analyze these alternatives for the purpose of selecting the best alternative, the best solution, and then that best solution then gets implemented as our public policy. So it's a very long, a very resource-intensive type of process in that we take all the information, we analyze it all, we assimilate it all, and we use it to then come up with the best solution to this policy problem. Now, obviously, the major advantage of rational comprehensive decision-making is just that. It is rational and it is comprehensive. So it does give us the most likely chance of coming up with the quote-unquote best solution, the best alternative to address this policy problem. But there are criticisms associated with rational comprehensive decision-making. One is the presence of what we call externalities. And if you've had the budgeting course or if you've had microeconomics at the undergraduate level, you're familiar with what externalities are. Anybody familiar with what an externality is? What do you mean by an externality? Jay, go ahead.
Could be something that's unexpected or coming from the outside of the organization that affects some kind of decision or some kind of plan, something that you didn't expect.
Exactly. Yep, you're exactly right. It's something that's unexpected, something that's unintended. There are unexpected, unintended consequences of the action that we are taking. So if we take this certain policy action and we implement this policy solution, we are hoping to address our problem. We're hoping to achieve our goals. But in achieving those goals, there are some unintended consequences, some externalities that can occur that we didn't anticipate, but they're still going to happen. Externalities, these unintended consequences, come in two varieties. There can be positive externalities and there can be negative externalities. A positive externality is something that benefits society as a whole. We didn't intend to do it, but it's actually a good outcome. So it's basically an unquantified benefit of pursuing this policy solution. So you think about something like a childhood immunization program. So we have a childhood immunization program that is there to service directly children from low-income households. Though your primary beneficiaries will be those children from those low-income households and their families who are directly getting those immunizations. But in theory, those immunizations will then hopefully stop diseases from spreading to other members of society. So other members of society who are not directly participating in the program are getting a positive benefit from this childhood immunization program. That's a positive consequence, a positive externality. The classic example of a negative externality is pollution. So your widget factory, as economists will tell us, they love to talk about widgets, but the economists have their widget factories up on a hill, and there's a river that runs behind that hill. In the process of creating these widgets, the factory ends up polluting the river that's running behind the hill. They didn't mean to do it. It's an unintended consequence, but it is clearly a negative consequence. That is a negative externality. So when there are a lot of these externalities, or what we call a lot of spillover effects, it makes it difficult for us to know what all of these externalities are and include them in our rational decision-making type of process. So the more externalities and the more spillovers there are, the more difficult it is for us to truly use rational comprehensive decision-making. But one of the biggest disadvantages of rational comprehensive decision-making is how realistic it is. So these policies are being made by human beings. Human beings are going out there and collecting the information, analyzing the information, assimilating the information, and turning that information into a full range of solutions. The problem is, as human beings, we have what Herbert Simon refers to as bounded rationality. There are limitations to just how rational we can be as human beings. We have cognitive limitations. Is it possible for us to go out there and collect all of the available information? No, it's not possible. We don't have the time. We don't have the wherewithal. We don't even know where to look for all the information. So it's really sometimes impossible to collect all the available information. If you're not collecting all the available information, then by definition, you're not going to be able to say you put together a full range of alternatives, because you don't know what that full range of alternatives are. You don't even know, there may be some alternatives out there that are very good alternatives that you never even thought of. And so that makes it difficult for us to actually choose the best alternative, because the best alternative may be something that we never even thought of, because we have these cognitive limitations. We didn't have the ability to think of these quote unquote best alternative solutions. So being purely rational is difficult for us to do, especially in the public sector. So we are rarely purely rational. There are times at which in our policy formulation process, there are what we call glimmers of rationality, where we have the time and we have the expertise and we have the ability to collect more information than we normally would be able to do. But it's likely that we're never going to be purely rational, comprehensive in our decision-making. So the second decision-making model, the alternative, is what's called incrementalism. And there's a very famous public administration scholar by the name of Charles Lindblom. And I'll put him in text chat. And Charles Lindblom wrote a very famous article where he talked about decision-making in public administration. And when he talked about decision-making, he said that we're very rarely rational because we have these cognitive limitations. So instead of being rational, we are more incremental in nature. And the way in which public policies are made and the way in which public administration is done tends to be more incremental than it is rational. Whereas rational was the root approach, because you're actually getting to the root of the problem. You think about a tree and you're getting down to the roots of the tree. The incrementalism approach is what he called the branch approach, that we never can really get down to the roots. So instead, we're just trimming up at the branches. We're making small incremental cuts on the branches of the tree rather than chopping the tree down at its roots. So he describes what actually happens in public administration as incremental decision-making. So in incremental decision-making, goals are not easily defined, and it's difficult to gain agreement on clear goals like you were able to in rational comprehensive decision-making. We're not able to collect all the information that's out there because we have this bounded rationality. So therefore, we collect as much information as we possibly can, as much as our cognitive limitations will allow us to collect. We then use that information that we have collected to put together not a full range of alternatives, because we can never say we have a full range, but instead we put together a limited range of alternative solutions. And then from that limited range of alternative solutions, we will then do what he calls making limited successive comparisons. So we will then compare solution A to solution B, and solution B to solution C. and solution C to solution D. And then we'll go back and compare A to D and B to D, and so on and so on. You make these successive limited comparisons between the solutions that you have developed, and then you will not be selecting the best alternative solution because you may have never even thought of the best solution, but instead you'll select the first alternative solution that is appropriate and works in this situation. So it's not the best, it's the first appropriate alternative solution that works for us in this situation now. And we then implement what we consider to be the first appropriate alternative solution rather than trying to find and implement the best solution. So incrementalism is a much more limited way of making decisions. And where we see incrementalism in decision-making the most is we see it in public budgeting. When you look at public budgets typically resemble a previous year budget. And that previous year budget resembles the year budget before that, and so on and so on. So we take the previous year's budget and we then add a certain increment of money to it, maybe 2 or 3%, and then that becomes this year's budget. That's what we consider to be incrementalism. Very small, marginal, incremental changes from one year to the next. And so usually when we are working in public policy, a lot of our decisions are being fueled by incrementalism as opposed to rational, comprehensive decision-making. Clearly, the advantage of incrementalism, it is more realistic. It takes less time, it takes less resources, it takes less brain power than a rational, comprehensive approach would take. The criticism, obviously, is that if you're only making small changes from one year to the next, if that policy is not working, then you're going to continue committing those errors year after year after year. You're essentially just going to end up throwing good money after bad. And you don't really have the opportunity to go back and make whole-scale changes to the way in which we design our public policies. Now, incrementalism probably occurs more than rational comprehensive for the reasons that we have noted, but incrementalism is not the only decision-making model that we use in public policy formulation. You can look at rational comprehensive and incrementalism as being diametrically opposed. So they are on opposite ends of the decision-making spectrum. Fortunately for us, there are other approaches, and another approach is in between. And another approach is kind of a way in which we can take the best of both worlds. So we can take the best of rational comprehensive as well as the best of incrementalism and combine them together into this approach known as mixed scanning. And mixed scanning comes to us primarily from this theorist by the name of Amitai Etzioni, which is a great name, I just like saying it, Amitai Etzioni. And Amitai Etzioni in mixed scanning says that we can combine rationality and incrementalism together in making our decisions. Well, how do we do it? We do it because we will be rational as we possibly can be for our big issues, and then we'll be incremental for our smaller issues. So if we're making a decision about constructing a new city hall that's going to cost us $70 million, that's a big momentous decision. So we're going to try and be as rational as we can possibly be. We're going to collect as much information as we can possibly collect, put together as many alternative solutions as possible to our cost benefit analysis. We're going to try and be rational because that's a very big $70 million decision. However, if we're making a decision about the number of staples to buy for our office next year, that's not that big of a decision, and we can certainly be a lot more incremental. So we'll look at the number of staples we bought last year, maybe we'll add 1% to it, and that's the amount that we'll buy for next year. So rationality for your big decisions, incrementalism for your small decisions. The advantage is it makes a lot of sense, and that you're combining the best of both worlds, rationality and incrementalism. What's the problem with mixed scanning? Anyone see any problems with mixed scanning? Big issues are rational, small issues are incremental.
Well, wouldn't
go ahead, sorry.
Wouldn't government be relatively big in general? You know, like how do you delineate between those two big and or small issues?
Yep, Tracy's got it exactly. What's a big issue and what's a small issue? That's kind of subjective in nature. So what is a big issue for one person may appear to be a small issue for another person. What's a big issue for that other person may be a smaller issue for someone else. So there is some built-in subjectivity here in terms of what is a big issue versus what is a small issue. And so sometimes it's hard to get agreement on what are our big issues, what are our small issues, when we should be more rational, and when we should be more incremental. Now, obviously, with the examples that I use, those are pretty clear types of issues. If we're going to build a $70 million building, we're going to put together a capital improvement plan. We're probably going to put together a master facilities plan. We are going to put together, a specifications document for what that building needs to look like and the types of things that we need in that building. We're going to put together, revenue projections. If there are parts of that building we can rent out to raise revenue, we're going to do all of that and be as rational as we can be. When I was on the school board, we passed a $148 million bond measure, a general obligation bond, to construct new buildings at our school sites and to modernize and do some reconstruction at other school sites. Before we did that, though, we put together a master facilities plan. And then we also put together what was called an education specifications document, where we called in members of the community. We put together cluster focus groups to really decide what should these schools look like and what types of buildings should these schools have. Should these schools have flex labs? Should they have dedicated science labs? Do they need to have libraries anymore? Do they need to have standalone computer centers anymore? And we put together the specifications that were necessary for each one of these projects that would be funded with this $148 million bond. So we did put a lot of rational effort, and we're as comprehensive as we could be in coming up with all these specifications for all these projects that would be funded with this $148 million bond. So there are times when you have those glimmers of rationality, but oftentimes we're more incremental. So kind of mixed scanning combines the two, but if it's not abundantly clear what's a big issue and what's a small issue, then we're not going to have concurrence on when we should use rationality versus when we should use incrementalism. But the fourth decision-making model I'd like to introduce you to tonight is one that I am a fan of, and that's what's known as garbage can model of decision-making. Now, I'm a fan of the decision-making model. I'm not a fan of the title. I think they could have named it better, but it's called garbage can model of decision-making. I don't like the title because it kind of just makes you think of a garbage can and you just throw everything in garbage can, you shake it up, and what you get is what you get. And that's not really how garbage can model of decision-making works. Garbage can model decision-making is kind of similar to John Kingdon's approach to agenda setting, in that decisions get made in the policy formulation process at the confluence of four different, what the authors call streams. So when these four different streams flow together at the confluence of these four streams, that's when we tend to make big changes to our policy. That's when we make big changes and we're more rational in the way in which we engage in policy formulation. The four streams that contribute to policy formulation are the participant stream, the problem stream, the solution stream, and what the authors call the choice opportunity or the triggering event type of stream. So in the participant stream, in order to formulate a policy or make a big change in the way in which we're addressing a policy issue, we need to have the quote unquote right people in place. We need to have the participants in the decision-making positions who are predisposed to making a decision, who are predisposed to making a big change to the way in which we are addressing an issue. You can think about welfare reform in the mid-1990s. And in welfare reform in the mid-1990s, we made a big change to the way in which we address welfare policy. Rather than using these very specific categorical grants, we replaced them with more general block grants. And we gave state and local governments a lot more flexibility in the way in which they move people from welfare into gainful employment. In order to do that, you had to have people in decision-making positions who were predisposed to making that big of a change. You had a Republican-controlled Congress, and you had a Democratic president in Bill Clinton, who was, before he came in the White House, one of the more conservative Democratic governors. He was the chair of the National Governors Association. He was the chair of the Policy Committee, which was a relatively conservative committee as part of the National Governors Association. He was willing to work with Republicans in Congress because they kind of shared the same view of how to reform welfare policy. So you have the quote unquote right people in place who are predisposed to making this change in welfare policy. Then you have what's called the problem stream. We've got all these problems that are floating around out there in societal consciousness that people kind of know about. They know their problems. But in order for us to actually address those problems, we need to end up getting agreement on those problems, that we can come to an agreement on what those problems really are and what's the nature of those problems. When we have an agreed upon problem, then we have what we call our problem stream. So if the participants agree upon what the problem is, then that makes it much more likely that we're going to formulate a policy to address that problem. Then your third stream is what they call the solution stream. So you've also got this stream of solutions, all these possible solutions to this problem that are floating around out there. The important thing here in garbage can model decision making is that solutions may predate problems. And when you think about rationality and incrementalism, the way in which those models are designed, you identify the problem, then you generate the solution to address that problem. So problems predate solutions. In garbage can model decision making, that's not always the case. Solutions may actually predate problems. I oftentimes like to refer to this decision-making model as the Quentin Tarantino approach to decision-making. If you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that they're oftentimes non-sequential. They kind of bounce around all over the place. Well, that's kind of the situation here. You can have a solution that had been developed 50 years ago to address a different problem, and you can then reach back and take that solution and apply it to a modern day problem. The solution that was applied to the problem in welfare reform of moving people from welfare to work was a solution called a block grant. Block grants had been around since the 1940s. They have been used for a variety of other purposes, but we were taking them and we're repackaging them and using them as the solution for this problem of the inability of moving people from welfare to work. So that's our solutions. They can be pre-existing solutions that actually existed before the problem. And then your fourth stream is this choice opportunity stream. A triggering event occurs. And when that triggering event occurs, it opens what Kingdon calls that policy window, which makes it possible to then make public policies. So if you've got a triggering event such as a triggering event, 9/11 is a perfect example of a triggering event. It was a triggering event that then caused us to make major changes to Homeland Security policy. We created a brand new Department of Homeland Security. We created a TSA. We came up with all these regulations for flight, ended up creating the Real ID Act later on in the Bush administration. So we really came up with these whole-scale changes to the way in which we dealt with Homeland Security policy because of that triggering event that galvanized public opinion around the idea that we really needed to secure the homeland and we really needed to do something to try and avoid a terrorist event like that from ever happening again. Here's another example of garbage can model decision-making at work in terms of policy formulation. So back in the 1990s, we had this accident. We had this airline disaster back in 1996. That was called the value jet crash. So he had this value jet and it crashed in the Florida Everglades. The reason why it crashed in the Florida Everglades is that there was an undetected fire in the cargo bay of that value jet plane. There's a fire that occurred in the cargo bay. There were no smoke detectors in the cargo bay, so that by the time the crew knew that there was a fire, it had already burnt through some of the electrical system and the plane was unrecoverable, and it then crashed in the Florida Everglades, killing 110 people in 1996. It was value jet number 582. When the policy was made to require smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes, you had this garbage can model decision making when you had all four of these streams flowing together. You had participants such as consumer right groups and outrage members in Congress who are willing to work together in order to promulgate a new policy to regulate smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. We knew what the problem was in airline safety for this instance, is we knew that we had an uncontrolled, undetected fire in the cargo bay of the plane. There's a variety of solutions out there in order to address it. The solution that was chosen was mandating smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. We didn't invent smoke detectors in 1996. It was already an invented solution that we then applied to this problem. And obviously the triggering event was then that ValueJet 582 crash in the Florida Everglades. That's an example of these four streams all flowing together to result in the formulation of a public policy, with the goal being to avoid any crashes in the future that are caused by undetected fires in the cargo bay of these types of airliners. So I think the garbage can model decision making really helps to explain a lot of the major changes we make when we formulate new public policies or whenever we modify significantly the public policies that we currently have on the books. And that's why I'm a big fan of this idea of garbage can model of decision making. And usually when we do have a big change to policy, we can usually identify the triggering event that helped lead to this change in our policy approach. So those are four different decision-making models. I think that you can see vestiges of all of them in policy formulation. I then again just kind of lean toward the garbage can model because I think it does a pretty good job of identifying a lot of the moving parts that go into formulating a public policy. But through this public policy formulation process, as we discussed earlier, public administrators have a role to play. It's not just elected officials. When elected officials are generating the solutions, the possible solutions, they look to the public administrators. When they are trying to define the problem, they look to public administrators because it's the public administrators in those agencies that are implementing the current policies that know what the problems are and know what the possible solutions are. And so that's how public administrators oftentimes contribute to this process of policy formulation. But even the best formulated, even the best designed policies are doomed to failure if they are not implemented well. And this is really where public administrators have a major role to play, is in the implementation of these policies. But we know as policies are passed by elected bodies, so as policies come out of Congress, as they come out of state legislatures, in order to get those policies agreed upon by a majority of legislators, they have to be relatively vague and ambiguous in nature. So a lot of the details that govern implementation are left out of the design of those policies. So it's then up to the administrators through the rule-making process to propose the rules that will govern the specific implementation and execution of these policies to help achieve those policy goals. So there's a big role here for public administrators to play in writing the rules and then implementing those rules. Implementation is not as simple as it sounds. In your basic high school civics class, it was Congress passes a law and the executive branch then implements the law, period, end of story. It's not that simple. We know there are a lot of things that can go wrong during implementation, even of the best designed public policies. And in public administration, one of the most famous policy implementation studies was done by Pressman and Wildowski. And Pressman and Wildowski did a study of the implementation of a federal program in Oakland, California. So they used Oakland, California as their case study. And they looked at how this federal program was implemented in Oakland, California. And what they found is there are a lot of issues that can slow down or stop the implementation of this policy. One issue that can slow down and stop implementation, they found, was the existence of multiple goals. So if there are multiple policy goals and those policy goals tend to be conflicting, that's going to make implementation of the policy very difficult. The more decisions that implementers need to make, the less chance for successful implementation. So if the policy formulators, if the elected officials leave it to the implementers to make a lot of these decisions about the specifics of how the policy will be implemented, that leads to a lot of conflict, that leads to a lot of dissension. It means that the implementation is probably going to be less successful. They said the intensity of the participants, how much the implementers believe in the policy, how strongly do they support the policy, will obviously have a big impact upon the success of implementation. They said the amount of bargaining and negotiation that goes on in implementation will also have a big impact upon the success or failure of that policy implementation. The more bargaining and negotiation that is required, the slower the implementation and the less likely implementation is going to occur successfully. Creation of new agencies. When new agencies are created by the federal government in order to implement a policy, those new agencies can end up actually co-opting a lot of those state and local administrators and make that implementation a little bit easier in nature through that power of co-optation. So there are a whole lot of things, a whole lot of issues that go on in implementation that can have an impact upon the success or failure of the implementation of that policy. Probably the biggest one that Preston and Waldowski point to is this direction of preference and intensity of preference on the part of implementers. So they ask the question, how positive or how negative are implementers about the goals of this policy? How strongly do they support or how strongly do they oppose the implementation of this policy? And how positive and negative they are and how intense that positive or negative feeling is will have an impact upon implementation. So in the chart I'm showing you on the screen here, that's basically a 2x2 type of table. So in that top left-hand cell, you have implementers who feel positively about this policy. They believe in this policy and these policy goals, and they believe very strongly in these policy goals. You have very little delay and you have no bargaining. The policy just is implemented the way in which it's supposed to be implemented because people strongly support that policy. If they support the policy, but they're not that strong in the intensity of that support, then you end up with some minor delays, but still not a whole lot of bargaining, but it will slow down a little bit because they're not willing to put forth the effort that they would if they truly believed in this policy and these policy goals. The real problem with delay and bargaining is when you get people, implementers who do not believe in the policy. So if they're on the bottom right and they don't believe in the policy, but there's very low intensity kind of negative feeling toward the policy, you'll have much more moderate delays and you'll have bargaining around peripheral issues. So you'll have bargaining that will occur, but it won't be bargaining about the essential parts of the policy, just around the peripherals. The worst situation, obviously, is if you have implementers who are strongly negative and have strong negative feelings about the policy. That's when you have maximum delay. And that's when you have people who are bargaining over every single detail of the essentials of that policy. And that's those types of policies that do not get implemented when you don't have the support of the implementers. That's a theme that is also echoed by another public administration theorist named Martha Durthik. And Martha Durthik says that the single most important part of successful implementation is to have the buy-in on the part of your policy implementers. And the way in which you get their buy-in is by involving them in the design of that policy. So if you can involve your implementers in the formulation of the policy, then they will have some skin in the game, so to speak, and they will then have some buy-in for the successful implementation of that policy that they helped to craft and they helped to formulate. So involving your implementers will ease the implementation. Even of policies that are not that well designed, they still will be easily implemented if you involve your implementers in the formulation process. So again, it just underscores the important role that public administrators have to play, not just in implementation, but also in the policy formulation process as well. And then once we implement the policy, we then need to evaluate the policy to make sure that the policy is achieving its stated goals and objectives. So we engage in policy evaluation. When we engage in policy evaluation, we are evaluating the policy in order to provide feedback that can then be used to redesign the policy or feedback that can then be used to change the way in which the policy is being implemented. So you have to have this feedback loop where you're generating empirical information that can then go back to redesign the policy or can go back to change the way in which we're implementing the policy. One of the biggest problems in the way in which we evaluate public policies is we try to evaluate them too soon. We try to evaluate them to see if they've achieved their goals and objectives before they are ready to be evaluated. Sometimes it takes some time before we can achieve the goals of a policy. So you think about a housing policy, and the goal of the housing policy is to house unhoused individuals. Well, if you implement that policy and then you decide 2 weeks later that you're going to evaluate it, you haven't had time to find places for these people to live. You haven't had time to renovate hotel space. You haven't had time to distribute vouchers. You just haven't had time for that policy to be successful. So there's something called the evaluability assessment. And it kind of sounds weird, but we will evaluate the evaluability of that policy. We will evaluate whether or not that policy is ready to be evaluated, because evaluating a policy too soon will lead to measurement error. It will lead to a decision that we are not achieving our goals, and then perhaps that policy ends up going away because of the results of that flawed evaluation. But our goal as public administrator is that when we evaluate the success of that policy, that information will actually be used by elected officials in redesigning that policy to try and make it more effective. Sometimes policy formulation is very political in nature, as John Kingdon tells us. And when it's very political in nature, sometimes elected officials want political benefits. Again, they want to get reelected. And so they want to get those political benefits of reelection. And so it's going to be politics that really carries the day in terms of which policies get formulated and reformulated and which policies get abolished, as opposed to basing those decisions on the actual empirical data that's being generated through policy evaluation. We do a lot of audits of our public policies, and the general, well, it used to be called the General Accounting Office, now it's the Government Accountability Office, the GAO at the federal level, conducts audits of public policies and public programs on an annual basis. And these audits can then provide for us information about how well our policies are functioning. There are two basic categories of audits that we'll talk about again next week when we talk about managing financial resources, and you'll certainly talk about in your budgeting course. There are financial or legal audits, and there are management or performance-based audits. In financial and legal audits, you are making sure that the money is being spent in the way in which it's supposed to be spent, that's being spent in the legally appropriated manner it's supposed to be spent. Performance management audits is where we ask the question, how well the money is being spent. So in a financial audit, you're asking, how is the money spent on this policy? In the performance management audit, you're asking the question, how well was the money spent? How well did we achieve our policy goals and objectives by spending money on this policy? But those audits are very important parts of the policy evaluation phase, and hopefully will then generate the empirical evidence we need to feed back through the policy process, to bring to bear on policy formulation, as well as redesigns of the way in which we are implementing those policies as well. But again, there are roles for public administrators to play in formulation, implementation, as well as in evaluation. And when you get to your PPA 670 policy analysis class, you will go through all those phases of the policy process, and you will learn specific skills that can be used to analyze policies, to determine how effective those policies are. You'll talk about things like cost effectiveness analysis. You'll talk about scenario writing. You'll talk about a little bit about cost benefit analysis, and all these specific tools that public administrators can use to analyze these policies for the purpose of either redesigning the policies or changing the way in which those policies are implemented to, again, make them more successful at achieving their stated policy goals and their stated policy objectives. So it's kind of just a little introduction to the policy analysis class, as well as what public administrators do in the three phases of policy formulation, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. But as we said at the outset tonight, those policies you view as kind of being the bridge. They're kind of that umbrella. And then what holds up that bridge, the stanchions that hold up the bridge, are these specific public programs that are designed to help us achieve our overall policy goals. So in addition to policy analysis in your core curriculum, you then also have a class in program evaluation. Now that class is PPA 696, and we still call it research methods. But even though it's called research methods, it's taught much more in line with a program evaluation course. And the reason is that in program evaluation, we are taking classic social science research methods and we are putting them in the service of evaluating our public programs. We are using these classic social science research methods to evaluate the effectiveness of these public programs in supporting our overarching overall policy goals and policy objectives. But before we get into program evaluation, it's 5:10, and so let's go ahead and take a break. I think it's probably a good breaking point. So we'll say a 10-minute break. If you all want to come back at 5:20, then at 5:20, we'll get into a discussion of what public administrators do when they evaluate public programs from an empirical basis. We'll talk about the different stages in program evaluation, And then we'll wrap up the entire show tonight by talking about, well, if policy analysis and program evaluation is all about the measuring the effectiveness of policies and programs, well, what is effectiveness and how can we actually define the effectiveness of our public organizations in implementing these policies and these programs? But go ahead and take a break, come back at 5:20, and we'll talk about program evaluation. Okay, it's 5:20, so welcome back. Let's shift gears now from policy analysis and move into program evaluation. And in kind of setting the stage for this, let's go back to our original example we used of the policy goal being to house unhoused individuals. And then we've got all these different specific public programs that are meant to support us in achieving that overall goal of housing unhoused individuals. So say one of those public programs is to convert hotel space and convert it into affordable living spaces. That's, in terms of measuring that, that's a much more direct and much more immediate measure than moving people from unhoused to housed status. That's a long-term type of process, and that's going to take months, that may take years in order to accomplish that goal. However, we can make immediate progress on this program of converting hotel space, and we can measure that relatively readily and relatively quickly. And so we can measure how many rooms we have been able to convert into affordable living spaces over the past 6 months. That's a measure of the effectiveness of that public program of converting hotel spaces into living space. So oftentimes these programs are a much more direct evaluation of achieving their objectives as opposed to the longer term policy goals. So in program evaluation, what we are doing is we are applying empirical methods to determine the effectiveness of these specific public programs. Now that definition is a pretty simple definition, but I think that it requires a little bit more nuance. And so when we talk about applying empirical methods, when we use the word empirical, empirical simply means something that is tangible, something that is measurable, something that we can feel, something that we can sense, something that we can measure. That's what we consider to be empirical. Empirical evidence can be both qualitative as well as quantitative. And unfortunately, sometimes when people think of empirical, they think of only quantitative. They think of only things to be measured with numbers. But we know that empirical can mean both things measured with numbers, quantitative methods, as well as things that are measured with words and phrases, which would be qualitative type of methodology. So it can be both quantitative as well as qualitative. It just means that it's tangible, it's information that we can actually measure. So whenever we are evaluating public programs, there are a couple of different aspects of public programs we can measure. One type of program evaluation we can use is what's called a program impact evaluation. In that program impact evaluation, we are measuring the impact of that program, the outcome of that program. So we would be measuring the number of hotel units that have been converted into living spaces for unhoused individuals. That's the impact of that program. We can also measure implementation and do program implementation evaluations, where we are evaluating not just the outcome of the program, but how that program is being implemented. So in a program implementation evaluation, we could look at the process we are using by which to convert those hotel units into usable living spaces. So we can look at the amount of money that we are spending, the amount of person hours that are being spent, the actual ways in which we are converting those rooms. That's the implementation aspect of a program evaluation. So we can do either impact evaluations or implementation evaluations, or sometimes we can combine the two together into one program evaluation where we are assessing both the impact as well as the way in which that program is being implemented. But we're applying essentially these classic social science research methods to evaluate these public programs from an empirical type of perspective. So the steps in program evaluation are somewhat similar to the steps you would go through in a social science research project. So you know, in any good social science research project, we have to develop a research question. In program evaluation, we develop an evaluation question. The characteristics of a good research question are similar to the characteristics of a good evaluation question. Good evaluation questions need to be clear. They need to make sense to everyone. Everyone needs to understand what we are asking in that evaluation question. They need to be answerable, in that there needs to be an answer to those questions. We need to be able to answer those questions with the collection and analysis of empirical information. And there should be more than one possible answer. If there's only one possible answer to an evaluation question, then we probably already know what that answer is. So there should be more than one possible answer. So here are a couple of examples, and these are examples that come from several years ago and the 696 case study that was used in directed research. And in that case study, we had a situation where we had a public program that was referred to as the Inmate Reading Intervention Program, otherwise known as IRIP. And in this IRIP, this Inmate Reading Intervention Program, it was a program by which we were working with inmates in terms of their literacy, in terms of working on reading and improving their literacy levels, with the hope being that as they increase their literacy levels, it would then lead to decreased rates of recidivism, decreased rates of reoffending. So a simple evaluation question we can ask is, does the Inmate Reading Intervention Program decrease rates of recidivism? Now that is a yes/no type of question. And if you remember from your research courses, you're probably told to try and avoid yes/no questions, because yes/no research questions don't generate a whole lot of robust, usable information. So another way you could phrase that question was, how does the Inmate Reading Intervention Program affect rates of recidivism? The first question, does it decrease rates of recidivism, is what we call a directional question. So we're asking if the presence of the program is leading to a decrease in recidivism. So there's a directionality there. The second one, there's no directionality. We're just saying, how does the program affect rates of recidivism? But oftentimes we ask the question, how, we generate some more robust type of information. But in program evaluation, unlike research methods, you oftentimes do see these yes/no types of questions being used, because we are trying to develop a direct measure of the effectiveness of that public program. So it is acceptable to use those yes/no types of evaluation questions in program evaluation, where it may be a bit more frowned upon in the world of classic social science research. We have to come up with a good, clear, answerable evaluation question that has more than one possible answer. Our second step, just like in classic social science research methods, is we need to develop variables and indicators of our variables. Usually what we are doing in program evaluation is we are measuring relationships between variables. The dependent variable that we tend to use in program evaluation is obviously the variable that is being changed. This is usually the result of the program. So in our example, this would be rates of recidivism would be our dependent variable. That's what's being affected. The independent variable is usually some measure of the program itself. So for the Inmate Reading Intervention Program, there are a lot of different ways we could design that as our primary independent variable. We could ask, how does participation in the Inmate Reading Intervention Program affect rates of recidivism? Our independent variable would be participation in that Inmate Reading Intervention Program. We could operationalize that participation variable in a number of ways. We could just score whether or not people participated in it. It's kind of a yes/no, what we call a binary variable. Either yes, they participated in it, no, they did not participate in it. We would code those who participated with a 1, those who did not participate, we code with a 0. Or we might want to be a little bit more nuanced with our measurement of participation in the program. We might want to measure the number of hours that they participated in the program. And so we would actually use that as more of an interval type of statistic. So this person participated 40 hours in the program versus this person who participated 10 hours in the program. So the assumption is the more hours they spend participating in the program, the more impact it will have on the likelihood of them reoffending and the rates of recidivism. But the independent variable, the primary independent variable, is going to be some measure of that program itself, either participation in the program or maybe existence of the program. And so sometimes what we do in program evaluation is we will measure our dependent variable before the program was implemented, and then measure it for many years after it was implemented. And then we look if the dependent variable after implementation is different than the scores on the dependent variable prior to implementation. So again, a lot of different ways we can measure that primary independent variable, but in program evaluation, that primary independent variable is some measure of the public program itself. But our goal is to draw this linkage between the public program, our independent variable, and the desired outcome of that program, which is our dependent variable. And as you know from research methods, in order to draw that causal linkage or even a correlational linkage between variables, you then need to identify what we call the control variables. Other variables that might also affect the dependent variable other than our independent variable that measures the program. So what other types of things could affect recidivism rates? Perhaps the type of crime that was committed, whether it's a violent or a non-violent crime. Perhaps if drugs were involved in the commission of that crime, that can have an impact upon the likelihood of recidivism. We know that if drugs were involved in the initial crime, then it's much more likely that person is going to reoffend because of that drug use and that drug abuse. Whether or not that person has employment once they leave prison, that could have an impact upon whether or not they reoffend. Whether or not they have a stable address could have an impact upon whether or not they will reoffend. Those could all be our control variables. And so we can hold all those control variables constant, kind of parcel them out of our equation so we can truly isolate the real impact of participation in the IRIP program on the likelihood to reoffend. And so we developed these control variables in order to isolate the real relationship between our program and its desired outcome, between our primary independent variable and our dependent variable, the outcome of the program. So again, very similar to the types of things that we do in classic social science research methods. Third step is we have to select a research design. The research design speaks to which subjects are going to participate in the program and which subjects will not participate in the program. Those subjects who participate in the public program in classic social science research are referred to as your experimental group. In evaluation design, they're oftentimes referred to as your project group. So in classic social science research, we call them experimental groups. They participate in the independent variable. They get exposed to the independent variable. In evaluation design, we oftentimes call them project groups. They're the ones who are being exposed to this public program, who are participating in this public program. And then we will compare their results to the control group. And the control group will be people who do not participate in the program, who are not exposed to that independent variable. In classic social science, we refer to those people as a control group. In evaluation design, we usually refer to them as a comparison group, but it's the same type of idea. So in research design, we decide who gets exposed to the independent variable and who does not, who participates in our program and who does not participate in our program. One of the most robust research designs you can have is an experimental design, such as that classic experimental design you see on the screen. The notation, if you remember back from your research methods courses, the R stands for random assignment, the O stands for an observation, and the X stands for the independent variable. So in this classic experimental design, we are randomly assigning some people to participate in the IRIP program, some people to not participate in the program. We are then collecting data on those individuals before they participate in the program and then collecting data after they participate in the program. We'll do the same thing then for our control group. But in an experimental design, you always have that R notation, that random assignment, where you as the evaluator can randomly assign some people to participate, some people to not participate. And then you can see some other examples of experimental designs, a Solomon four-group design, a post-test only comparison design, a pre-test, post-test single group design. You'll talk about all these different research designs when you get to your PPA 696 course. But for our purposes, we're mostly interested in the categorization of an experimental design. An experimental design is one that uses random assignment to randomly assign who participates in the program and who does not participate in the program. Now, that can be problematic when we are dealing with public programs, especially when we are dealing with entitlement programs, programs in which people who meet certain eligibility requirements are then legally entitled to participate in those programs and derive benefits from those programs. When people are legally required and legally allowed to obtain benefits from participating in a program, we cannot deny them that participation and deny them those benefits just for the purpose of our program evaluation. We cannot do that. It's not legal and it's not ethical. So oftentimes we cannot randomly assign people to participate and people not to participate. Instead, our subjects will self-select whether or not they participate in that program. So it's impossible for us to have that type of a random assignment. When it's impossible to have that type of random assignment, we cannot use an experimental type of design. And instead, we have to use what's called a quasi-experimental design. In a quasi-experimental design, we are not choosing who participates and who does not participate. The subjects make that choice on their own. But what we are doing in a quasi-experimental design is we still need our experimental, our project group, and our control group, our comparison group. We still need them to be equivalent on every other characteristic other than participation in the program. If the only difference between your experimental and your control group is that the experimental group participated in the program and the control group did not, then any differences in your post-observation can be attributed to participation in the program. So we need our groups to be equivalent to each other and only differ in participation in the program. We cannot do that through random assignment in a quasi-experimental design. So instead, we will create equivalent groups through the use of statistics. So this is where we use those control variables. So say in order to make our experimental and control group equivalent to each other, we will measure both our experimental and our control group in terms of their the type of crime that they committed, whether drugs were involved, whether they have a stable address, whether they have stable employment. We will use all those as control variables. And then we can then say that our two groups are equivalent to each other once we control for all those other variables. And the only difference is participation in the program. And once we get to that point, then we can say any differences in their recidivism rates can then be attributed to their participation in this inmate reading intervention program. So a quasi-experimental design is the most common type of design to use because we legally and ethically and practically cannot deny people the rights to participate in the program that they are legally entitled to participate in. And one of the most common types of quasi-experimental designs that we use in program evaluation is a longitudinal time series type of analysis, where we will collect information on our variables over a period of time, which will then allow us to identify a pattern and trend in our data. And then we can see before they participate in the program, how they scored on these variables versus how they scored on these variables after their participation in the program. Anytime you have variables that have the potential for changing in value over time, it's usually advisable to use a longitudinal time series type of approach so that we can identify and embrace those changes in our values over time. But the bottom line here is in program evaluation, we're typically going to use a quasi-experimental as opposed to an experimental design because we do not have the ability to control who participates in our program as public administrators, as program evaluators. Step 4, we have to decide, well, who is going to be involved in our research? Who are we going to include in our program evaluation? And there are two different types of what we call sampling designs, two different ways we can put together the sample of people that we will be collecting data from in our program evaluation. One type of design is a probability design that uses random sampling. Well, what does random mean? Purely random sampling means that everyone in the population has an equal non-zero chance of being selected to be part of the sample used for this program evaluation. We use samples because we do not have the resources and the time to be able to collect information from our entire population. Our population is just too big for us to collect information from the entire population. So we will take a subset of that population that we hope is representative, so that the characteristics of our sample represent the characteristics of our larger population. So if we randomly select members of our population to be in our sample, we are using what is called a probability type of sampling design. Probability sampling designs come in a lot of different varieties. Probably the most robust probability sampling design is what's called simple random sampling. Simple random sampling is we'll take everybody in our population and we will assign them a number. We will then randomly generate numbers and select numbers from our population to then become part of our sample. So we'll have a random number generator. And a lot of random number generator programs, you can Google them and get them online now today very easily. Back in my day, in the back of statistics textbooks, there are random number tables that you could use, but you randomly generate numbers, and then that tells you which cases to select to be part of your sample. That will create a very representative sample of your population. The more representative the sample is of the population, the more valid your results are going to be. Sometimes we cannot do that. Sometimes we don't have a list of everyone in our population, so we can't go through and assign everyone a number. When we don't have a ready-made sampling frame, then we might want to use something called systematic sampling. Systematic sampling, an example of that could be if we want to evaluate the programs that are being provided by a local health clinic, and that local health clinics providing these programs on an anonymous basis. We do not know, we don't have a list of all the patients who are using this local health clinic. So we can't do simple random sampling. So instead, what we may do as an evaluator is we position ourselves outside this local health clinic. And then maybe every 10th person or every 20th person who comes out of the clinic, we interview that person to see how satisfied they are with the services that they're getting from this clinic, what types of programs they participated in through those services with that clinic. And we'll interview every 10th or every 20th person. That's known as systematic sampling. It's not purely random, but there is still a random component to it because you're randomly selecting every nth number of person who leaves that local health clinic. Another type of probability design is what's called stratified random sampling. And so if there's a characteristic we want to divide our sample up according to, we can use stratified random sampling. So if we want to divide our sample up according to gender, we can use stratified random sampling and stratify our sample according to males and females. We could do it according to Democrats and Republicans. We could do it according to elderly people, people over the age of 70 versus people under the age of 70. There are a lot of ways in which we can divide up and stratify our sample. That's called stratified random sampling. And finally, another type of probability design is what's called cluster sampling, multi-stage cluster sampling. This is something we use a lot in program evaluation. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we want to evaluate the impact of a public program on households, but we do not have a ready-made list of every single household in the state of California. We don't have that at our disposal. What we may do is we may start with a random list of counties, and then we'll start with a list of counties, then we'll randomly select maybe 10 counties. And then from that randomly selected list of 10 counties, maybe we will select 3 cities from each of those 10 counties. And from each of those cities, we will then randomly select a random selection of neighborhoods. Then from those neighborhoods, a random selection of streets, and then from those streets, a random selection of households. And that's how we will then be able to do our program evaluation at the household level, even though we didn't have a ready-made list of households in the state of California. Multi-stage cluster sampling. At every stage, you are randomly selecting a different cluster until you get down to the unit of analysis that you want to focus on for your program evaluation. So those are all what we call probability types of designs using random sampling. Sometimes we're not able to use random sampling, and so we end up doing a non-probability type of sampling design. So one example that would be convenience sampling. So if I want to know what you think about the MPA program, you're all right now in front of me in this Zoom session, so I could ask you because you're all readily available to me. It's convenient for me to ask you. You would then constitute a convenient sample. Do you represent all the other students in the MPA program? Perhaps or perhaps not. I don't know that. And so since I don't know if you represent the rest of the MPA population, I cannot take my results from this convenience sample and generalize it to say it applies to the entire MPA program. But it's very quick, it's very easy, and it's very low cost to do a convenience type of sample. So if you're just getting started with your program evaluation, the very early stages, kind of get a sense of what people think about a program, you may be able to do a convenience type of sample and save some time and money. If you're dealing with a population that's very hard to contact, so you think about a population of people who are homeless, you use what's called a snowballing technique. You can't contact these people at an address because obviously by definition, they do not have a stable address. So you interview one person who's in that population, and then you ask that person to refer you to someone else who may be in the homeless population. Then you interview that person, ask them to then refer you to someone else in that population, obviously called snowballing, because as you get these referrals, your sample gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But it's not a random process because the person that they're probably going to refer you to is someone they know, maybe a friend of theirs, maybe a family member. So it's not really a random way of putting together a sample. But sometimes it's the best that you can do if you're not able to do a random type of sample. Step 5 is to collect our data. And in program evaluation, we do sometimes collect original data. And when we are collecting the original data, we oftentimes collect it through using surveys. Surveys have become very popular in program evaluation. They are a pretty quick and pretty reliable way of collecting data on the effectiveness of programs. The way in which you do survey research, though, will dictate how reliable your data are. And so when you're doing surveys, you'll spend some time in 696 talking about survey construction, how you write survey questions, how you sequence survey questions, how you distribute surveys, because you need to do a good job of survey construction in order to get usable data. If we're fortunate, there will already be secondary data sets that are available for us to use to collect our data. Sometimes there are other researchers, other evaluators who have already put together a data set. We can then use that data set for the purpose of our program evaluation. Once we have our data collected, we then have to analyze our data. And oftentimes in program evaluation, this means statistical analysis. Sometimes in program evaluation, we're doing descriptive statistical analysis where we are just describing the typical case. And so we're describing the typical participant in this public program. That would be a descriptive type of evaluation. Sometimes we're doing associational type of research where we are trying to see what is the association between participating in this program and committing this type of a crime. What we're oftentimes doing in program evaluation is we're doing causal-based research, where we're asking those causal questions of how does participation in this program affect our dependent variable? What is the result of participating in this program? Is participation in this program leading to the desired outcome that we want to achieve in this public program? So that's what we call causal type of research. If we're doing causal type of research, the statistic that we will be using will be much more sophisticated than the statistics we use to do descriptive or associational types of evaluations. Typically with causal types of evaluations, we're getting in the world of multiple regression, binary logistic regression, some of those more sophisticated types of statistical tools. But typically in program evaluation, we're applying some type of statistical analysis to the data that we have collected. And then we're using that statistical analysis in our final step to arrive at conclusions. Conclusions about the effectiveness of this program. How well is this program achieving the goals that it was supposed to achieve when it was first designed and implemented? This information that we get from this program evaluation, just like what we got from a policy analysis, we can then feed that information back into the redesign of the public program and feed it back into changing the way in which we are implementing that program in order to try and increase the likelihood of this program achieving its ultimate goals and objectives. And typically the achievement of those goals and objectives is what we are considering effectiveness of the program. We want to continue to fund effective programs that achieve their goals. We want to not fund programs that are ineffective and that are failing to achieve their goals. So when you get into your 696 research methods class, you will talk about all the specific things that you do and all the specific tools that are available to public administrators in conducting these types of public program evaluations. So there is quite a bit of overlap that the 670 policy analysis class does dovetail very well with the 696 research methods program evaluation class. And sometimes when students take those courses together in the same semester, they will see a lot of that overlap. And sometimes it's useful when students take those two courses together in the same term. But the overall goal of policy analysis and the overall goal of program evaluation is to determine effectiveness, the effectiveness of our policies, the effectiveness of our programs. And in the study of public administration, we are very interested in the effectiveness of our organizations. Our ultimate goal in studying our policies, our programs, and our organizations is to create effective policies, programs, and organizations that are achieving their stated goals. So since we put so much time and effort into measuring and studying effectiveness in the public sector, I think we need to spend a few minutes talking about what we mean by the term effectiveness. Now, when we say the term effectiveness, we usually think about effectiveness as, did we achieve our goals, or how much progress did we make toward the achievement of our goals, whether they be organizational goals, policy goals, or program goals. However, I would like to introduce to you other ways of thinking about effectiveness as well. And specifically, I want to introduce you to 4 different models of assessing effectiveness. One approach of assessing effectiveness is the one that we have been using so far tonight, and that is what we call the goal approach to measuring effectiveness. How well did we achieve our stated goals as an organization, for a policy, or for a program? So we define effectiveness as the achievement of goals. A second approach, though, is what's called a systems resource approach. A third approach is called the participant satisfaction approach. And a fourth approach is called the internal process approach. So let's deal with all 4 of those approaches in turn for measuring effectiveness. So the goal-based approach, the one we've been using up to this point in time, is the simplest approach. It just draws that linkage between our stated goals and our effectiveness. If we're achieving our goals, then we can say we are being effective as an organization, that we are being effective in terms of implementing our policies and our programs. The shortcoming of the goals approach to measuring effectiveness is that the goals approach is really concerned with the output side of the equation, but it doesn't really think about a lot of the complicating factors that can impact that outcome and that output of the organization. It doesn't consider things such as conflict between goals. So if you're defining effectiveness as the achievement of your goals, but if you have goals that conflict with each other, it's going to be difficult for you to say you're being effective just because you're achieving one goal, because by definition means you're not achieving another goal if they are in conflict with each other. It doesn't really help you consider different types of goals. And so we have long-term goals, we have short-term goals. We have what we call official goals, and we have what we call operative goals. An official goal is the long-term goal of an organization or a long-term goal of a policy or a program. An operative goal is a step along the way. And so operative goals give us kind of these mile markers that we can achieve along the way. If we achieve each one of our operative goals along the way, then eventually they will help us achieve our official goal. So just because we're not achieving our official goal doesn't mean we're not being effective in achieving our operative goals that will help us along the way of then eventually achieving that official goal. So basically the goals approach is a very simple approach, just looking at the output of the organization, the output and the outcomes of the policy and the program. Another way in which we can measure effectiveness is what's called the systems resource type of an approach. And this is very much akin to open systems theory that we talked about last week when we talked about the theoretical approaches, the neoclassical approaches to public administration. In the systems resource approach, we measure effectiveness as the ability to bring in resources from the environment, the ability to exploit resources from the environment. So an organization is considered to be effective if it's bringing resources from its environment, if it's bringing in new workers, a new labor pool with new skills, if it's bringing in additional revenue through appropriations or grant money, if it's bringing in political support, those are all resources that can be brought into the organization. A policy or a program can be considered effective if it's also bringing resources in from the environment. And so if a program is encouraging elected officials and members of the public to support that program, that's a measure of effectiveness. So are you bringing in resources, and how well are you bringing resources into your organization? This is essentially what we talked about last week when we talked about open systems theory and negative entropy. This idea of importing new energies and importing new resources from the environment. So the better you can bring new resources in, the more effective you will be as an organization, program, or a policy. Oftentimes in measuring this systems resource approach, we will do a longitudinal type of approach where we will look at the beginning of the process of implementing this policy or this program, what types of resources were available, and then we look at what resources are then available down the line longitudinally after a number of months or a number of years. So we kind of compare before and after to see how well we're bringing these resources into the organization, the policy, or the program. A systems resource approach is useful for measuring effectiveness when an approach like the goals approach is difficult to use. So if we're having difficulty identifying the goals that we are trying to achieve as an organization or a policy or a program, if we cannot identify those goals, it's going to be difficult to use a goals approach. So we might be able to use a systems resource approach as a measure of our effectiveness. A third measure of effectiveness we use in the public sector is the participant satisfaction approach, where we look at our relevant stakeholders and we ask the question, how satisfied are our stakeholders with our organizations and the services being provided by our organizations, with the programs and with the policies that these stakeholders are participating in? You have two stakeholder audiences that you're looking at in participant satisfaction. You have external stakeholders, so members of the public, elected officials, your appropriators, those are your external stakeholders. And then you have internal stakeholders, your employees, your human resources, who are actually working within the organization. How satisfied are your employees within the organization with what the organization is doing and how our policies and our programs are being implemented? So we're looking at the satisfaction of our key strategic constituencies and stakeholders in the external as well as the internal environment. When we are looking internal into the organization, we are really starting to take more of a human resource type of approach to measuring participant satisfaction, because we're looking at the satisfaction of our employees and we're trying to enhance their satisfaction levels. So the more satisfied our employees are, the more satisfied they are with the rewards they gain from the organization, with what they're doing in terms of implementing these policies and these programs. That's a measure of effectiveness. From an external perspective, the more satisfied our external stakeholders, such as our citizens and our elected officials, are with what we are doing as an organization, that also is a measure of effectiveness. So participant satisfaction can be either external and or it can also have an internal focus. And when it takes that internal focus, it kind of bleeds over into more of a human resource management type of an approach. And then the fourth way we can measure effectiveness is what we call an internal process type of approach, where we look internal to an organization or internal to the implementation of a program or a policy, and we look at the actual activities that are going on within that organization, within the implementation process, and we look for indicators of internal health as measures of effectiveness. So some of the possible indicators we can look at with an internal process approach, we look at the culture within our organization. Is there a strong culture? And is there a positive work climate? We kind of look to see if there's a teamwork spirit, kind of this esprit de corps, as we would call it, with group loyalty and a good teamwork type of attitude within our organization. How much confidence, trust, and communication there is between workers and management. How decision-making is done. Is decision-making done near information sources, meaning that those people who know the most about the organization, know the most about our programs and policies, are the ones that are able to make the decision, irrespective of where they may rest in the organizational structure and the organizational chart. Is there a good communication flow in terms of the sharing of relevant facts and feelings vertically and horizontally within the organization? Do we have the proper rewards and incentives for performance growth and development of subordinates within the organization? And how does the entire organization interact in all of its parts working together to implement these policies and these programs? Those are all indicators of organizational health, and those indicators are all indicators of effectiveness of the organization in implementing its policies and its programs. And to drill down even more in terms of some specific dimensions and measures of effectiveness, this screen shows you 30 different dimensions and measures of effectiveness that we can use to define the effectiveness of our organizations in the public sector. I'm not going to go through them all, obviously, but things like productivity, if you're a government corporation, profit, for a lot of our organizations, that doesn't matter in the public sector, the quality of the outputs that are being produced, the growth of the organization, employee turnover as a measure of the satisfaction of our internal constituents, the amount of motivation and morale and job satisfaction among our human resources, how flexible and how well we can adapt to changes in the external environment, how good of a job we do with goal setting, how clear our goals are. Do we have consensus on what those goals are in the organization and for our policies and for our programs? The skills, interpersonal skills and task skills of our managers and leaders within our public organizations, how well we utilize the environment, how ready we are for change in our external environment, what external entities think about our organization and our programs and our policies and how they evaluate us, the stability of our operations, the value we place upon human resources, the avenues and opportunities for participation and shared influence among all the members of our organization who are implementing these policies and these programs, how much training and development we have, these professional development opportunities to help develop our employees as human resources, how much emphasis we place upon achievement, both as individual employees as well as achievement as an organization and achievement of goals of our policies and our programs, all discrete measures that we can use to measure the effectiveness of what we are doing in the public sector, in our organizations, and in the implementation of our policies and our programs. Now, I just introduced to you the 4 different models: the goal attainment model, the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction model, and the internal process model, to illustrate for you that effectiveness is a multi-dimensional type of term in the public sector. And there are a lot of different ways that we can measure effectiveness. And when we say an organization is being effective, or a policy or a program is effective, we need to know how we are defining that effectiveness. Is it by achievement of goals? Is it in terms of acquisition of resources? Is it in terms of satisfying our key constituents? Is it in terms of maintaining a healthy internal process within an organization? There are lots of different ways in which we can measure effectiveness. But most of our attempts at reform over the past several decades in the public sector have all been attempts to try and enhance the efficiency and the effectiveness of what we are doing in public administration. So when you think about effectiveness, think about those 4 different models and what you actually mean when you say, we are trying to make this organization more effective, or we're trying to enhance the effectiveness of this public policy, or we're trying to enhance the effectiveness of this public program. But as public administrators, as we run our organizations, as we formulate and implement our policies and our programs, we are probably doing it in order to try and achieve higher levels of effectiveness. So we need to know how we are measuring that effectiveness term, because it is multidimensional and there are many different ways we can measure it in the public sector. On your final assessment, you are going to be using these 4 different models of effectiveness. And so are there questions about these 4 different models and how these 4 different models measure effectiveness in the public sector? Because it's something you're going to have to talk about in your final assessments. Any questions about what we've discussed so far with policy analysis or program evaluation? Again, the goal there is to kind of get you ready for your 670 class as well as your 696 class. Just like last week, we kind of got you ready for your 660 course as well. Any questions on anything we've covered so far in policy analysis or program evaluation? If not, then where we are going to go from here is that next week, we're going to move into some other functions that public administrators, public leaders, and managers engage in, most notably how they manage their human resources, and how they manage public taxpayer money, how they manage their fiscal resources. Because a lot of your time as a public leader or manager will be spent dealing with other people in the organization and managing those human resources, as well as dealing with financial resources, because money is the lifeblood of an organization. When an organization doesn't have the requisite amount of resources in order to pay its staff, to pay its lease payments on the office that it is renting, it's just going to have to go out of existence. So it's very important that we know how to manage those fiscal as well as those human resources. So we get together again next Tuesday. Those are kind of the two main topics that we will cover. I think we'll have ample time next week to cover both of those topics. And then that information from next week will give you the information you need to then answer scenarios 1, 2, and 3 on the final. So when we are done with matching fiscal resources next week, we will have all the information we need in order to be successful on the final assessment. And at that point, we will then reassess where we are at. I would like to provide that very last session, our 8th session that we have scheduled. I would like to provide most of that time for you to finish up your final assessment, because your final assessment will be due on that day at midnight. And so I kind of want to give you some time to do that. In these hybrid courses, because we're only an 8-week course, we are still required to provide time for a final assessment. And so that final session we'll probably use for you to work on your final assessment. I'll be available to answer questions on the final assessment, but I think we'll probably wrap up our information next week with our management of fiscal resources. And that's kind of what I'm planning over the next 2 weeks. Well, that's all I have for you tonight. So we have kind of an early night tonight, which I think we could probably all use a little bit of a break. So if you have any questions on any of this information, feel free to reach out to me as you are working on that final assessment. Any questions about that, send me an email. I'm happy to answer any of those questions. I'll have this recording all done and up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning if you want to go back and review any of this information. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Have a great week, and then we'll be back at it again for week number 7 next Tuesday at 4 o'clock. So take care, everyone. Have a good week.